That's my hair. And it got dark, that helps. So, my name is Grace Davis, Jewel told you that. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a board-approved supervisor. And what that means is that if somebody has a master's level social worker who wants to become a clinical social worker, I can supervise them into that status. So I know some of you in your programs may have social workers who want to be able to take that next level to be providing some clinical services. That's just what I do. So some people are like, what is the S for special? Yes, it is for special. So, but I am in private practice now. 4 years ago, when I left the drug and alcohol world, I went into private practice, and at that time I was teaching at Texas State, really SWT, Beat 'em Up Cats, and the School of Social Work, and supervising social workers who want to be clinical social workers, and also providing mental health services. So my clients age range right now from 3 to 80. So I kind of see everybody. That's why I have bubbles, because I have bubbles. I was going to put them outside, but the wind's pretty bad, so we didn't do that. But I also have practice in Wimberley. So I'm 2 days a week in Wimberley and 3 days in San Marcos. You would think that, well, why would you go to Wimberley? Well, literally, Wimberley, people won't drive from Wimberley to San Marcos. They don't want to drive to Austin. There's a huge need in Wimberley, and so 2 days a week I'm there and I see clients. And one of my first clients there was a woman whose son had been tragically killed. There are a lot of young people who are dying in Wimberley, many of them from substance abuse, others from tragic accidents. And so there is a need for that. When I talk about surviving grief, I remember when I started off as a social worker, I went to work in Houston, and I call it my 6-year tour of duty. If you've ever been to Houston, it's like being in a war zone, right? So anything you do there happens in multiples of 3,000. So what might take 10 years to get experience in this part of the state took 3 minutes in Houston. It was just that much. So at one point I was working with a group of physicians, and they were cancer doctors. And I had known people with cancer. Some of my best friends are cancer nurses. So I love nurses. And those nurses, and I would say to them, oh gosh, I don't think I could ever work with a cancer patient. Never say never. Because sure enough, I spent 2 solid years working with cancer patients and their loved ones. And what we talked about was grief. And it was learning how to grieve before someone was gone, and learning how to grieve while they were leaving, and then grieving after they were gone. So grief comes in all shapes and sizes and in all people. And so in doing that work, I remember the first time it really hit me, because I was young then, I still am. For those of you who don't know, I started when I was about 6 in this field. I've been doing it 30 years. So yeah. Anyway, I was driving down the road. I can tell you exactly what I was doing. I was leaving Pasadena, Get Down, Dina, or Stinkadena, depending on whether or not you've been there. I'm driving down 45. I'm headed to downtown Houston, and I'd been working with a lot of patients who were close to death, and I'd been in the hospitals working with them. I had privileges in Bayshore Hospital, so I would see clients in their hospital rooms as they were either being treated or at end of life. And I was driving down the road, and all of a sudden I felt my car sink, literally sink in the freeway. It was as if I was being sucked down. And I literally remember looking over to my passenger side going, this is bizarre. The road is not sinking. There was nothing major happening in the world. There was no earthquake in Houston. And I remember in my mind seeing a skeleton sitting next to me in my car. And that was the first time that it really hit me that I was dealing with the level and intensity and experience of death that was going on. At that time, I was in my mid to late 20s. I mean, I had lost people in my life, but it wasn't that devastating. I was losing clients that were incredible people. They were fascinating, and they told great stories about the history of Pasadena, and they could tell you way over there off Strawberry, that was a field when I was growing up. We used to shoot dove out there. Get these old men with colon cancer and lung cancer and prostate cancer. They would be telling these great stories, and women who had raised children and become doctors and nurses, did all kinds of things. And in that moment was when it hit me. This is what it feels like to share death with others. And And then I went back and did it the next day. And you wonder, after that happens, why do you do this? For all of you, there's been a patient that meant something so much to you that professionally we cannot say that we are upset that this client has died. Well, I've cried with family members, I've cried with patients who are dying. I don't think that that's the good thing to do, is to say, well, I'm in this place and I can't cry with you, right? I can't cry with your loved ones. I can't be emotional about your loss and what it means. And so for me, it's about looking at, what does grief really mean? And so we have to survive it. Otherwise, we get succumbed by it, right? And we're gone. So we think about those couples who've been married 80 years, right? She dies. We had a couple in San Marcos recently. He was 95 when he died. The two of them were the king and queen of the Mardi Gras parade in San Marcos. It runs about 6 blocks down one part of town. They were the king and queen, and they got all dressed up. They were in their 80s. He died in November. She died in February. And she said to her family, I'm not going to the doctor. I'm not doing what you want me to do. I don't care about rehab. She was brokenhearted. Now her children are grieving 2 parents within 3 months. But they have to grieve it, or they join them, right? So we have to learn how to survive our grief, or we don't. And so it's about talking about it. We are a death denial society. How many of you know someone who uses Botox? Or who uses any facelifts, anything they can do to not look their age, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. We are a death denial society. So we take herbs and we jog and we die running down the street. How many firemen have died jogging? I'm like, stop jogging. Stop being healthy. Healthy is killing you. Let's be happy. Happy is good. Donuts, have donuts. Of course, that's not what we want to say, right? We still want to be healthy. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but every now and then have a donut. If it's a blueberry donut, it doesn't count, so I'm just saying. So we know that people are doing everything they can to not be their age, instead of celebrating their age. I turned 59 on April 3rd. That is a big deal. My cousin texted me and said, can you believe we're 59? I said, don't remind me, and it beats the alternative, right? Because I'm not ready to be dead. And there are some people who are ready to be dead. They've been in pain, they've been hurting, they've been sick, and they don't want to do that anymore. And we have to honor that as well. So we're a death denial society, and we don't talk about it. And how many of you know someone who said, do not take your children to that funeral because they will be devastated when they see their grandmother who's gone? Why? Death is a part of life. Life is a part of death. You don't get death without life. And when these kids aren't exposed to reality, we can't take them in to see their sick grandmother or their aunt or their dad because they'll be too upset. They're going to be more upset, and I'm going to see them when they're in their 20s and 30s because you denied them the opportunity to say goodbye. I encourage my patients to bring their grandkids in, to bring their kids in and give them a task. Have your granddaughter fill up a water pitcher and put it by your bed every day. Let them be a part of your passing, not an absent, or just a standby. Everybody's crying, they're going in and out of the room and they won't let me in. If you lost someone, how many of you here has lost someone they love dearly? Yeah, you're all still here. You're surviving it. You may not feel like it sometimes, but you are. And so it's important to know. So some of the things that I want to talk about is how do we survive it, and just some things we need to know. May there be comfort in knowing that someone so special will never be forgotten. That's what grief is. We wouldn't grieve if we didn't care. Have any of you lost someone? You're like, thank God they're gone. Raise your hand, you know you have. It's probably been an in-law, mother-in-law, father. No, it could have been a really bad neighbor, that kicked your dog or whatever. But even then, you have to feel bad and go, okay, bless her heart. That's what we say in Texas. Whenever we don't like me, but bless her heart. So, how lucky am I to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard? Wow. Ugh. And that's the piece with my clients. And I lost 5 clients in 4 months last year. Amazing. Just amazing. And people are like, you did what? And I didn't kill them. First, let me say that. It wasn't because of the work I did with them. They were ill. One of them committed suicide. Still grief if someone takes their life or not. But when it's hard to say goodbye, we know we're hurting, and that's the important piece, is knowing that if you didn't care, it wouldn't matter. You'd say, see ya. Instead, we have funerals and memorials, and we put things online, and Facebook opens up, and everybody tells great stories. Even though those of you who have had friends with those great stories come out, you're like, oh, but I know the bad side too. Can I tell that story? When they didn't give this or didn't do that. We always find the best in people when they're gone. It's too bad we don't always see it with them when they're alive. So, and Winnie the Pooh is the one that says that, how lucky I am to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard. That's the grief. That's where we are, is saying goodbye. So there's several definitions of grief. You know, people say, well, are you grieving? Are you grieving? What does that mean? Are you mourning? What does that mean? So for some people, it's very visible. I noticed that 1, 2, 3, 4 of us that are part of this presentation are all in black. Isn't that what we wear? How many people wear bright pink to a funeral? Some do. We're shifting that mentality of, oh, I've got to be so dismal and dark. Why don't we talk about celebrating life? And part of that is being able to not hide behind what we have traditionally done in this country, and the world is be in black and say that, hey, we're missing this person. We can do that in lots of ways. So a deep and poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement. So when you're bereaved, you're grieving. It's sorrow, and especially what's caused by someone's death. We also talk about grieving pets, grieving change of a job. You know, many of you have had a job that you really loved, and something happened, and suddenly you were gone, or the company was gone, or a new boss came in and thought you were crazy and shipped you out the door. That's grief too. Loss is grief. Grief is strong, sometimes an overwhelming emotion for people, regardless of whether their sadness stems from the loss of a loved one or from a terminal diagnosis they or someone they love have received. Now, the Mayo Clinic talks about this. When someone finds out that they've been diagnosed with cancer, and I still work with cancer patients. If you don't know about Flatwater Foundation, I want to tell you about them briefly. Flatwater Foundation was started by a man whose father was diagnosed with colon cancer in the Valley. And what Mark learned was that there was no emotional support, no mental health services for his father, his mother, or him and his siblings. Livestrong Foundation would let you get 5 free sessions. 5. You think you could do all that you need to do in 5 sessions? No. Flatwater says if there is a cancer patient or their family who needs help, they will cover that cost at an agreed upon amount for someone to get counseling as long as they need it. My best friend who died of metastatic breast cancer in 2020 was seen for 4 solid years by a psychologist, PhD psychologist in Austin, and never paid a dime. It's amazing. It saved her life, gave her life for the last 4 years of her life. I worked with a patient who lived alone. He's actually from Lockhart. He had no family, no children, no spouse. He had a dog, and worked with him for 3 years and was with him 3 days before he died in the hospital. So grief is real, and he grieved his prostate cancer diagnosis from the day he was given it. And in the end, was able to say, I'm tired of fighting. I never wanted to die, but at one point said, I'm ready to go. And that was hard to hear because he had fought so hard. But the treatment wasn't working anymore. And at some point, when you stop. And so we know that grief can come with a diagnosis. And we have to acknowledge that it happens at all kinds of times. Many of you have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. She wrote a book about grief. And she talked about 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. That's nice. There's nothing wrong with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. That's not how I operate. I'll talk to you about how I deal with grief. Her information is important and a baseline, for what we need to know about grief, but this is how I'm going to show you what I do with clients and how I talk about grief with my clients. Grief begins at the time that you know that death is coming. Now, do you know that when someone gets that COPD diagnosis, oh gosh, you're going to die, so you have COPD. Is that tomorrow? Do I have a clock? Is there 50? Can we pick that time? There's some things I'd like to do. And if I could make that list, if you knew what day you were going to die, would it make it any easier to die on that day? Would you do things different today if you knew the day you were going to die? I know a lot of people said, oh, I'm getting me some credit cards. And I'm traveling. I don't care if I pay my bills. My kids can do what they want because I'm not going to be around. I mean, would we really do something different, or would we be more responsible instead of less responsible? Would we be sad or happy? I mean, do we really want to know when we're going to die? So when we're sitting in a hospital and the doctor says, oh, they have 3 days to live. What do we do in those 3 days? Watch the clock. 36 hours, 24 hours, 12 hours, and 6 months later, Granny is still alive, right? She wasn't ready. The doctor was, but she wasn't. So we need to be mindful of that. It can begin when we know that death is coming. It can at the time of the diagnosis, at the time of death. But what was it for you? When do you think you started grieving when you lost someone that was most important to you? When did you start grieving? Do you remember?
I think it was when it was in my mother, and I think it was when we had to contact hospice and get involved with hospice. That was
The dreaded H word.
yeah.
They get a bad name and they shouldn't. Dying with dignity is what we did 200 years ago in this country. But when we hear the word it's time for you to call hospice. The reality is we should all call hospice and find out what they do now, before we need them. I don't know how many of my hospice nurse friends have worked with patients that have been on hospice for 3 or 4 years. They come off hospice and they go get a cancer removed off their nose. They have the surgery, Medicare pays for it. They come back, they get on hospice. Okay. And they're still around. But it is true. When someone says hospice, our heart sinks, right? And shame on us for not being better at educating the world on what hospice really does. It's better than it was when I started this work in 1990. Let's see, I moved to Houston in 89. So in 93, so what, 30 years ago, hospice was there, but it was like, how do we convince families to use them? It would be the best thing. I remember the doctor telling my dad, there's just nothing else we can do. We need to stop treating you. And my dad looks at me and I'm like, no, Daddy, we'll do whatever you want. But when he said, I'm ready for hospice, and hospice came, we knew he was making a stand to say, I don't want to do anything heroic. Doesn't mean I want to die. It just means I don't do anything heroic. Don't do anything heroic. And we get those two things mistaken. If I call hospice, that means I'm giving up. That is not true. And we need to teach people that. It's just not true. So I want you to think about when your grief started for you and when you were dealing with someone who you have grieved since they were gone. It's a common experience. What I find is that most people don't know what that looks like. So sometimes when I see clients, I'll say, who's the closest person that you've ever lost? And some of these kids will say, and I work with college students too, they'll say, no one. I've never lost any. Both my grandparents have been alive, my parents are alive, and they may have lost a college friend in a car accident, to a drunk driving situation, to suicide. They don't know what to do with this feeling. So it's really about, if you've never lost someone, now it's new territory, right? And that's what's important, is to know. And even if you lost a pet, I'll say, have you ever lost a pet? Oh yeah, my pet, whatever, Max, ran away, and I remember being so sad. So my parents just got me another dog. Well, that's one way to do things, but I can't bring back your friend. But we can get you close to your friends and see if they can help. So we don't deal with what that loss and big loss looks like. The only way out of grief is through it. You can't take a pill, and in fact, if you do take a pill, I can almost 100% guarantee you this, it will prolong your grief. When people medicate their grief, they go through it longer. I don't want to be sad, you need to be sad. I don't want to be anxious, you need to be anxious. I don't want to be depressed, you need to be depressed. Those are all normal feelings of grief. When you numb them and you can't see them, then you're in trouble. And I've seen it prolong. When someone's a victim of a crime, there's a grief of how do I go back in my house? I'm too afraid, same thing. You gotta grieve that change. And how do I do that? So we'll just medicate you. So then you pass out like a zombie and you don't wanna be awake, and 10 years later, now we're dealing with what you needed to deal with in that time. It's not that doctors are doing the wrong thing, they're just not thinking. There's a difference between medicating someone out of feeling and medicating someone to control the feeling. They're two different things. And oftentimes, people will be medicated out of the feeling. And we need them to feel because that's how they get there. If you don't deal with it, it's gonna find you now and later. It's just gonna find you. Those boxes that you put that feeling in are gonna be wrapped in chains. First it's gonna be ribbons, and then rubber bands, and then rope, and then chains. And then you're gonna find a metal box and put that around in your head. And then suddenly all those things are gonna start to fall off and that grief is gonna show up. So it's important to know that it's just gonna be there. And that time is a healer. The first year is the hardest, the absolute hardest. The first birthday, the first Christmas, the first Thanksgiving, the first Easter, the first anniversary, maybe the first graduation. All of those firsts happen in that first year. And so I always encourage my clients that I know are in end stage of life to write letters to their loved ones. Leave something for your granddaughter that you know someday she's gonna get married, and you put her name on the front, and in your hand, or with a video, because we have that technology, videotape yourself and leave it with someone who can give it to them on that day because that child loved you so much and they know you thought about them in that moment and in their future. It's an incredible gift. People think that's the weirdest request ever, but it is the best. Because when someone opens that letter that says, my grandmother thought of me on the day I would be married, and here's her advice: don't iron his underwear. Wouldn't that be wonderful if you knew your grandmother, and if you knew mine, you would know why she said don't iron his underwear, because she did iron my grandfather's underwear. That's what she did in the 1930s. And so it's important to know that we can give gifts to the people we left behind and gifts to the people who are leaving. We can give them that opportunity if we're mindful of it. And grief is work. There's nothing easy about grief. It sucks. It sucks. S-U-C-K-S. It sucks. There is nothing fun about grief. People say, I'm done. I have grieved the loss of my mother. Really? Is that why you're drinking a 6-pack a day? You're so numb you don't even know that you miss her, and you didn't talk to her for 10 years. Let's talk about all of the stuff that you missed. And then just acknowledge. Your choice not to talk to her was because you felt like she was nosy. She wouldn't let you have your own life. And those are things you did. What would you tell her now if you could talk to her? Let's go to her grave. I've had people who had bad relationships with their parents and estranged. Write a letter, go to the grave, stand at the grave and read it. Get it out and leave it at the grave. Freeing, empowering, an opportunity, a start, those things are all there. So it's important that we know that grief is work. And I can tell you, people show up and they're like, you want me to work? And I'm like, well, no, I don't care if you, well, I do care if you work or not, but I want you to feel better. That's why you're here, right? I'm not here to take your money, because that's not the part, that's not why I do this. I want to help. If you don't want help, I get it. Maybe I'm not the person to come see. Because I'm going to push. Not easy. I'm going to push. Some therapists are, nobody lays on, okay, well, people lay on my couch, but not because they should, because they put their feet up, they lean back. I'm like, what is this? This is, but it's not about that. It's not about just coming and letting someone just say, I miss them. It's working toward being on the other side of I miss them and having them as a part of your life. So where I operate from, and when I talk about grief, is this, not Kubler-Ross's model. I don't, or Stephen Kessler, the two of them work together. Kessler also writes some stuff. He talks about the 7 stages of grief. But I operate from the stages of adjustment, because grief is not uncommon to the world or to all of us. Grief happens, and we have to be able to acknowledge that it's an adjustment in our life of the loss of the person that we cared about, right? So we have to adjust to life without them. So I operate from this. Shock, denial, fear, anger, sadness, loss, depression, acceptance, and assimilation. 9 stages. Now, adjustment happens when you're driving down the road, coming down Highway 80, you're gonna turn on 143 and head to Lockhart, and somebody cuts you off. Isn't there a stage of adjustment that happens in that moment? Aren't you in shock? What just happened? The denial, oh no, they didn't do that. That didn't just happen, did it? And if you're alone, you're talking to yourself. And we go through these stages, and we work all the way through it, and we keep driving down the road. When we've assimilated that there are jerks on the road that are gonna cut us off, we have to pay attention. And so we get angry, we get sad because it could have wrecked our new car, then we would have lost something we worked hard for. We get depressed because, oh my God, is everybody a bad driver these days? And then we say, okay, I'm a better driver, I can accept this is gonna happen, and it's part of the driving scenario in my life, and I've assimilated that process, and down the road I go. That was pretty quick, wasn't it? And it can happen that fast, or it can take 4 years. So we know that the stages of adjustment are critical in identifying what goes on in our life. Shock. The definition, a sudden upsetting event or experience. It is upsetting to lose our loved ones. That's a given, right? And when we're in shock, we do crazy things. Anybody want to share something you did while you were in shock? Learning about someone who was ill? Or who had just died?
People say some really not appropriate things when they're in shock.
Yeah, I think my first reaction a lot of times when I'm kind of like caught off guard is to laugh.
Why are you laughing?
Not appropriate.
And it is appropriate, because that's your way of releasing the emotion that's bottled up. If I stood up here with this bottle of water, well, it's not water. This is a bottle of Diet Coke. It looks like water, but in real life it's Diet Coke. And as I talk, if I stand here and I'm walking around and we're doing this conversation, and I just keep shaking it, and I get close to some of you, and I look down, and I'm shaking my Diet Coke, how many of you are going, please don't come to my table? Right? Because pretty soon, what's gonna happen? If I set it down, you're like, oh, thank God. She put it down, it didn't blow up, we're all okay, I don't wanna get dirty, what's she thinking, the woman's crazy. Then I just walk over, not even thinking, pick it up again and start shaking. Now you're going, okay, now we're in trouble, because she really is crazy. And she's gonna spray this Coke all over me. And I come over here and I'm like, do you know that's really what's happening? You're like, get back. This is our emotion. If I don't open the lid and release pressure and let it spew a little bit and then close it back, eventually it's gonna blow. And that is how we are internally when it comes to grief. If we don't release pressure, whether it's through laughter, whether it's through crying, we're eventually going to blow. And in every part of this stage of adjustment, you'll see that if I just keep shaking through it and I don't release the pressure, somebody's gonna blow, and it gets all over everybody. Depending on the person and the family, it might just get over their kids, but it could be their siblings and the remaining parent and the neighborhood and the world, and it just spews, and you're like, whoa, get back. Put the lid on it, tap it loose. Because you know what happens when you roll a Coke in a can, right? If you tap the top, and then you open it, it's like, see, it didn't splash, because I knew that. I knew that if I tapped it and opened it, it wasn't gonna go anywhere. The Diet Coke was gonna be fine. But I had to learn that trick. The first time I rolled a Coke, when I was a teenager, and opened it, and it went everywhere, I went, that's not good. And so that's our emotions. When we release and it goes everywhere, we're like, ooh, that's not good. So you feel like, okay, so my laughter is inappropriate, or I said something that was inappropriate. Maybe if I get that doesn't feel good to me, then the next time I might do something different. But for some people, that is their release, and it's okay, we just have to acknowledge it. So in shock, it's that first feeling at the time of death or at the time of the diagnosis, oh my gosh, you now have cancer. We have a limited amount of time. What does that mean? Okay, okay, we gotta make this plan and do this and do this. So shock is a very common place to be. When someone gets stuck in shock, they never accept the diagnosis or that the death has happened. They're still in shock. You see them. Everything is like, no, they're not gone. Let's walk into the hospital room, right? Do you want to say goodbye? No, they're not gone. They can't be gone. Somebody go in there, do something. And so it's important that we recognize that shock is a natural part of what happens in the first stages of grief, or in responding to grief. In denial, we're convincing ourselves that something is not real or it's untrue. No, you don't have colon cancer. You don't have a heart condition. We need a second opinion. Well, this was the third opinion and the fourth opinion, and they're still looking for someone to say, no, it's not true. So denial is really a large river that we all walk in. So I'm not gonna believe that this is really gonna happen. So I'm gonna act as if it isn't. So you really don't need my help. I don't have to come every day. It's not that big of a deal. Wait until they're sicker. So denial happens and it's very deep. The loved one is not gone, and so what happens is, they're not gone, they're gonna be back. I'm gonna come home one day and they're gonna walk in the door. A friend of mine's wife died of a heart attack, and he said, I would walk into the house every day waiting to hear her voice for months and months and months. He actually moved out of that house because he couldn't do it anymore. Her voice wasn't there. And she died with all of them in the house. She had a heart attack in the bed when she was taking them out. 52 years old. And the diagnosis is not that bad. Oh, you have breast cancer, but it's all right, because they got great treatment. It's not gonna be a big deal. This is gonna work, Try everything, do everything. The denial that at some point you have to stop. We had a patient at one point that said to the physician I worked for in Pasadena, I don't care what you do. I don't care if you bankrupt Medicare. I don't wanna die. You do whatever it takes to keep me alive. The physician I worked with, Dr. Mohammed Haq, said, you need to have another doctor because there's some things I can't do, and I can't promise you that I can never ever let you die. You are going to die. And whether it's from this or getting hit by a bus in Houston. But you are gonna die. And he found a physician who did everything and beyond everything, which was all about money. And it was so tragic. This man was in such denial about death. I don't wanna die, I'm too afraid to die. And ended up dying anyway. Fear, an unpleasant emotion that something is likely to cause pain. We can agree that losing a loved one causes pain, right? Watching a loved one suffer causes pain. So the fear of that pain coming, hearing from physicians who say, well, you may have bone pain, you may have joint pain, you may have, your feet may swell and you can't walk, and so you're gonna be stuck in a chair, and the pain of having to ask, and this is another pain, I have to ask my loved one to give me a bath, to change soiled clothing, underwear. For a proud father and a proud mother, that's so incredibly hard. And how do we work with them to understand it's okay? And their fear, because the patient is grieving at the same time the family is. They're grieving, what am I gonna do and what's this gonna look like? And the family's grieving, what am I gonna do when this happens and after it happens, right? So we've got a lot of grief going on, and sometimes nobody's talking about it. So I'm afraid to be without my loved one. I believe that in the couple that passed away in the last couple of months, I think she was just deathly afraid of not being with him anymore. They were connected at the hip. Profitable business, long-term business in San Marcos, and he was her everything. And he was going to heaven without her. Oh no, that ain't happening. I am coming. And so it was a peaceful event. She fell asleep, and I'm sure he just came down and said, all right, you're here. I set it up. Come on, let's go. There's a parade. Let's get in it. So that fear, and the fear that we feel, the fear that the patient feels. And what does life look like without the person that you lost? What does it look like now compared to when you first lost them? Anybody think about that?
I think it's easier. It's still very painful, but it's not as apparent, like the pain.
It's not that you love them less, is it? Because it doesn't hurt as much?
No.
Okay. And I think that's what we're most afraid of. What if I can't? One mother said to me after her teenage son was killed, I'm afraid I'm gonna forget what he looks like. That was her deepest fear. I'm afraid I can't close my eyes and see him. I'm afraid because he will forever be 13, 14. And all of his best friends who in the town she still lives in are growing up, and it's been 2 years. Tomorrow will be 2 years since his death. And they are driving cars. They're in high school. They're doing the things that she's watching those kids do the things her son would be doing, and that reinforcement of, and why isn't he here? And why isn't he here? Is so hard. And so, what does life look like without them? And in that beginning stage, we can't imagine. You know, it's too fearful to think, what am I gonna do when I have a question and I can't call? When my father died, it was less than 12 hours before I had a question. I went, dadgummit. Less than 12 hours. So you know I called. I called a sergeant who knew him in Spain when they were in Rota. He was in the Navy. I called the sergeant who was on the base and I asked him, can you tell me when Daddy ran with the bulls? He goes, yes. Go read Iberia, page 356. That's about your dad. I mean, I didn't know it was going to ask about running with the bulls, right? But the fear of, what if I have a question and I can't ask him? You have to find a way around that to be able to say, hey, I can find other people who knew this person, or hopefully find someone who knows this person. In some cases it works. My client who died here from Lockhart, there's no one to ask. There's no one who observed it, and that's fearful as well. So we have to decide what life might look like. Anger, feeling annoyed, displeased, or hostile. Anybody know a family who has hostile members when someone dies?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a fist fight. You can't have that chair. Boom, boom, boom. Right? You're grieving and stuff becomes everything. It just becomes everything. And so we get angry because I've had this mother say, I shouldn't have let him go to his grandparents' house. I should have paid better attention to what was going on. Spouses saying, I should have made them go to the doctor sooner. I should have. You could should yourself to death, right? And so when we look at that, we just need to talk about it. I should have made him go to the doctor. How do you make a grown man go to the doctor? Is there a way that any of you two could share with us how that
The rest of the room would like to know.
Say that again, Nicole.
Said the rest of us would like to know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, absolutely. And so, and I've had more wives say, I should have made him go to the doctor when he said he hurt, when he said something was wrong, when he was, feeling bad. I should have done that. And I'm like, could you make this man do anything prior to that time? And they're like, well, no, but I still should have tried. And so they're beating themselves up about what I should have. And the anger comes out mainly internally. Or it's at the other person. It can come as I should have made them do something, or I'm so angry at you for leaving me. When I have spouses that are stuck in anger, because people get stuck in every one of these stages, and it spins and it spins and it spins and it spins. They're angry that he did this to me. He didn't do that to me. She left me. She didn't tell me how to pay the light bill. I let her, so that everybody has something. My child should have known better. Should have known better than what he did. No one was there and saw the accident. So we don't know what he did. We don't know what happened. And that unknown is very painful. That I, the doctor, the hospital, the facility did not do enough to help heal or save my loved one. We want to push that blame off and we get angry at them instead of just acknowledging I'm angry because they're gone and I have to move on. As hard as that is. Sadness, feeling unhappy or sorrow. We've all been sad. There's a difference between sadness and depression. People think if you're sad, you're depressed. No. But if you're depressed, you probably have some sadness going on, right? They're not equal, but the reality is unhappy or sorrow. Of course we're unhappy when we leave someone we love. We absolutely are. We can clients withdraw from each other. They feel heartbroken or miserable. And so when we're sad, it's important to talk about that sadness. I don't want to be alone, or I do want to be alone. And we need to let people have some space, acknowledge that they may need it, but also say, isolating doesn't help. COVID created more grief in this country than anything else. People grieved their jobs, their co-workers. They grieved driving, their commute, go figure. You know, getting stuck on I-35, can you imagine that? I'm grieving not seeing all those cars. Not, I remember we never shut our office down. We didn't shut our office down 1 minute, 1 day at all. We saw clients every day in our office when they wanted to come in San Marcos at Cedar Creek. We did not transmit COVID to anybody in that 2 years. We sterilized, we sanitized, we UV lighted everything. We sat 6 feet apart. We did it all. But we stayed open. Because we believed that when people couldn't be isolated at home, they needed someplace to go, and this is where they could come. So sadness is there and grief happens. Even in processing our loss of the life that we had for 2 years, right? So we've got to move forward. And you have a death on top of, I can't go into the hospital and see my loved one who's dying. Oh my gosh, it was so overwhelming. It still is. For those people who could not visit with their loved ones in the hospital, it was devastating, and my heart goes out to them. It was horrible. And then we have loss. Something has been taken away. If you had a physical, so physically, the parent, the spouse, the child, they're physically gone. Physically gone. But the other part of that is there are other things that get taken away. Finances. How many single women who lose their spouse drop their income overnight to less than half of what they were living on because their Social Security is that much different? Now they can't stay in their homes. They can't stay in their communities that they're in. I mean, it is devastating. So the loss is not just of the physicalness of the person I love, but is everything they bring to the table. Support, joy, an idea of what is my retirement going to look like. When I hear of people who end up losing a loved one, when they go into retirement and within 6 months that person passes away, they're like, we had all these big plans. We're going to do all these big things. So there is that sense of loss and identifying it. What are all the losses you will have or have as a result of this death? And then depression, a persistent feeling of sadness and loss of interest in life. I have a woman right now I'm working with whose husband died. It'll be 2 years in July, and she has checked out. She was active in the Baptist church, active in the choir. She doesn't want to go. She sits at home. She got a second dog, a reason to not leave her house. So we have to be mindful that when depression sets in, we need to talk about it. I don't want to go on. Okay, I hear that. You don't want to go on, but why? I know you love to shop. Do you think you shop in heaven? Probably, but you don't have to pay anything. But, maybe you don't. How many sets of wings do you need, right? I mean, come on. So, but what does that mean? So when the depression sets in, now this is what I would say. If someone is stuck in depression, again, the first year. If you're depressed for a month or two, I'm not going to freak out so much. But if you're depressed, talking about suicide, thinking of ways to let yourself go, and in this case, I called the police on this woman twice. And let me tell you why. First time, she had never missed an appointment with me, and I'm like, where is she? And I'm calling and I'm calling and I'm calling and I'm calling. She's not answering her phone. She lives alone. I know her husband is gone. I call the police, not the sheriff's office, the police. Yeah, she's in the city. Called the police and said, we do a wellness check. Everybody needs to know about wellness checks. You call and you say, I need a wellness check on this person. They live alone and I'm worried about them. Call me back. They went. She wasn't there. While they're walking around her house, she shows up. She was thankful that I cared enough because she felt so alone that I would call and have someone come check on her. That can make a huge difference in someone's movement through their grief. So know that that's an option. The second time I called was she had reached out to me and said she just didn't want to live anymore. And this was a different statement than she had used before, and I immediately called the police, and they took her to the hospital with a mental health transport, and they kept her for about 10 hours, and they drove her to San Antonio to her sister's house, where she decided dying was not what she really wanted to do, when she was reaching out for help. So we have to be mindful that when they're that depressed, when someone's thinking suicide, we have to reach out and help. And this is where she was. Acceptance. We have to accept. We have to embracing the present to move toward the future. I have to accept that my loved one is gone. This is at the end of the stage of adjustment. That's where that first year is, right? I accept that my child is no longer in my life. I accept that my spouse is gone. Acknowledging that the loved one is gone. They are gone. For this mother who lost her son, they were sleeping in her son's room for 8 months. Her other 2 children were sleeping in that room with her just to be close to his memory and his things, because it was a tragic accident. And now as the kids are moving on, mom is moving on. The room is still there, and it's natural, and it's exactly the way he left it that morning. But the kids are not sleeping in his room anymore. She is not sleeping in his room anymore. They're doing other things. So we can see that they're accepting that he's gone, and that life does and can go on. It already has. When we get to this place, it's like, I didn't think I could live after the death of fill in the blank, but I have. As much as it's hurt, as much as I've done, I have. And so sometimes it's like, I will say to my clients about every 3 months, tell me where you were 3 months ago. Because I want them to see how far they've gone. Where were you 3 months ago? Oh yeah, 3 months ago I couldn't even step out the door without crying. Cried all day long. Anytime someone looked at me, I was crying. Anytime I said their name, I was crying. Now I can say their name and not cry. It's huge, isn't it? It's huge. And so that's the acceptance that this death has occurred, this change has occurred, this grief is occurring in my life, but I've accepted it. We all have a picture album in our life. So on the day you were born, somebody put your little baby picture on the front end of that album. And you started putting pages in the picture album of your life. Anybody ever heard the song that Garth Brooks sings, The Dash in Between? It's an old song, it's probably 25, 30 years old, but it's a great song. Because the song talks about our lives are not our date of birth and our date of death. Our lives are the dash in between, and what we make of it, and what other people make of our dash, and what they say about our dash. And so it's about noticing that I am going on and continuing, and I can be able to say, this person was important to me. So the picture album of your life, the pages are turning. But if you get stuck on one page, this death, and things are still happening in your life. You go to work, you pay the bills, you eat, you do whatever you do, right? And you're stuck on this page. It's that grief. That's where I'm stuck. I can't accept that this is a page that I'm going to turn in my album of life and start adding other pictures in. I'm still living, but I'm not putting another picture in because this has happened to me. The reality is an acceptance. We say, okay, this is real. This picture is real. And then we move to assimilation, and that's where we start adding other pictures into that picture album of our life. We taking in and fully understanding that the death has happened. That's the assimilation. It's a part of my story, but is not who I am. So the picture album of your life includes this experience, and speaking of the death is possible and brings on less emotion. Fred Warren Davis Jr. was my daddy. He turned 70 that day. And the day he died, my sister and I were with him. And, he was on hospice. He had COPD. He had been in the Navy. He worked in the wool business for 80 years. He knew sheep. And as they say, sheep shit, because it really stunk. And he scoured wool, and if you ever wore a wool coat, jacket, scarf, that wool had to be washed. And he was one of 3 companies in the world that did it. And he knew sheep. And the day he died, he was at home, and my sister and I were with him. Hospice had been there. He was not communicating. We had grabbed a box. We were looking through that box, and there's a picture of him in 1952 in his football uniform, and he had on a pair of leather lace-up tennis shoes. And my sister and I thought that was the funniest thing ever. I said, "Look at Daddy. He's got on leather lace-up tennis shoes." The original Converse, I might add, high tops. And as we started laughing, he died. because I had been around him on his oxygen for years, and my sister said, something's happened, and she ran in, and he was gone. And I believe in my heart of hearts, he knew we were gonna be okay. So, there's my daddy. Do I grieve him? Yeah. But I grieve him differently now than I did when he died in 2017, because it's been time. When I see his stuff, I think about him, I laugh, I talk to him all the time. Say, I know, Daddy, I didn't wash the truck. And it makes me feel better. And when I see cardinals, and I feed birds outside of my house, I have tons of cardinals. And another, kind of a second mom of mine died before him, and when I would see a cardinal, I would think Wiley, and then there'd be a second cardinal, and there would be Daddy. And so, you have to let yourself have these feelings. You have to speak to others. You can't be ashamed of how you feel. You can't let people hide it. You've got to let them talk about it in any way. If a kid needs to write a letter, draw a picture, do a collage, let them do it. Honor your loved one by taking care of yourself. Don't drink yourself into oblivion. Don't let others do that. Find what works for you and do that. If you need to run, okay, be healthy. But if you need to work out, if you need to go to the gym, if you need to paint, if you need to do whatever, do it in moderation and do it and know that you're processing how you're feeling. Don't be afraid to ask for help and seek others who can help you. I don't want to see my clients for 100 years. I want them to be able to go, move on, see other people. But sometimes that doesn't happen. They want to stay. And I'm like, no, you're good. You're good. And so we work towards seeing each other. This particular mother I've been talking about, I saw her every week for about the first year, because she was, as you would imagine, devastated. And from there, we've gone every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, and now we're almost to once a month. And that's what I want. That's the progress of grief. And that's what's important. And this is my mom. The night she died, this is a woman who was afraid to die. She was in the hospital. She had been in the hospital 6 times last year, never got COVID. Never got COVID. She was on a ventilator for 5 days. Stopped speaking English. My mother's from Spain. Stopped speaking English and was speaking Catalan, which how many of you speak Catalan? It's kind of what the hospital said. So I'm writing translations in Spanish and in Catalan to get them to communicate with her. She was on a ventilator for 5 days and they got her off the ventilator. She lived another week or so after that, and she never wanted to die until the night she decided that she wanted to die. So we had no warning. We were going to put her in a facility, get her strength back. Doctor came in and said, Miss Davis, you'll be fine. You're just going to have to work hard. And oh no, she had already worked hard her whole life. She survived the Spanish Civil War. Isn't that enough? Right? So the doctor handed her card, Miss Davis, here's my card if you need something. And literally this 88-year-old woman sitting in a recliner in the hospital tears it up in front of this little pregnant doctor. Who's like, well, okay, I think I'll give one to your daughter. And hands it to my sister. At that moment, she started calling to God in Spanish and saying, come get me, I'm ready, what's wrong, I'm sorry, come get me, come get me, come get me, come get me, come get me. I am a firm believer that God said, I don't know what's going on down there, and I don't know where her family is. All you angels, grab your stuff and get down there so she will shut up. And down they came. And that was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My sister was with her at 5 o'clock. I got there and she's still calling to God. We're calling family in Europe. We're calling her. We called my niece, my nephew, my significant other, my brother-in-law, because my sister and I weren't there. And we got her to hear their voices and them hear hers. Her only living sibling is in Barcelona, and it was after midnight when we got him on the phone for him to say goodbye. And then we moved her because she was not on hospice. I called hospice. They were going to come the next day. Most people don't get there in time, right? So she moves from a recliner into the bed, and you got to know my mother. When I would say, Mama, we need to talk about your funeral, what do you want? I don't talk about it. Mama, we need to talk about your funeral, what do you want? I don't want to talk about it. Mama, let's talk about this. We've got to talk. She'd go, I have a headache, get up, walk away. And she did that for years. She would not talk about her funeral. She would not talk about anything. And so when she decided on that day, come get me, we're like, what? This is a woman who did not want to die. At 10 o'clock, she started looking up, and I'd say, Mama, what do you see? And she'd say, Angeles, Angeles. And she'd point. And she'd put her hands down. And then a little bit later, she'd reach up and hug somebody. And my sister and I were on either side of her. Yeah, we were bawling. How do you say, excuse me, could y'all leave? How do you tell angels not to go? If my mother's seeing angels, there's angels. I'm just telling. So she grabbed and hugged someone. She started directing them like they were singing. And she started moving her feet. And my sister said, are you marching into heaven, Mama? She nodded her head. 2:30 in the morning, she died. And I told the nurses at the hospital, she went to heaven with antibiotics on board. They were giving her Rocephin for pneumonia. And they did not pull it because there was no DNR. And I told the nurses, let me tell you something. When she dies, you're not going to know for 15 minutes. Because I am not coming to get you. You are not going to do anything. You are not doing anything. And it freaked them all out. I mean, all of them. They're calling a doctor who never called back. They're, running around trying to figure out what to do. And I said, you don't need to know when she's gone. And 15 minutes after she died, I walked outside. I talk to her every day. And sorry. And so now when I get ready to go home and I go to call her, I can't. And that's that anticipatory grief. Before she died, I knew there would be a day when I couldn't call her. And so when I would call her, she'd drive me crazy. Bring me a banana. A banana? What do you need a banana for? If you're going to the grocery store tomorrow, I want a banana now. Does anybody have that kind of mother? And there it is, my sister in crime. And so, and again, when you say, okay, God, you can't have her. And so it's when I can't call her that I miss her, and it's only been 6 months. But grief isn't going to kill me. It's just going to make me use a whole lot of Kleenex. So don't be afraid of your grief. And don't let the people you work with be afraid of their grief. Give them a chance to feel it. They're going to be better on the other side of it. And have really great stories. Right? Do y'all have any questions? Thanks for coming to this. What you have on your table are some things you can give out. The funeral home, this particular information came during a funeral I attended in Uvalde, Texas, which is where I'm from. And the funeral home actually has this available to people who come out. So there are some pointers for people, you can turn one on if you want to.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
For
lights.
people with, so there's things what you need to know about grief. Take this and copy it. I know you're not gonna sell it, but you can see who it's written by. It's about sharing with people what they can look for and do with teenagers and kids and losing a spouse and what does grief mean. And so all of those things I think are important. But when you think about this